The coffee trembled in Laura Bennett's hands as she poured it into the chipped mug at 5:47 in the morning. Not from fear. From muscle memory. Her fingers remembered field hospitals in Baghdad where the ground itself shook with incoming mortars, where you learned to pour without spilling because a single drop of coffee might be the last comfort a dying soldier would taste. She steadied her wrist, counted the breath, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and the tremor stopped. The ICU break room at St. Michael's Hospital was fluorescent lit and institutional, smelling of burnt coffee and someone's forgotten lunch rotting in the back of the refrigerator. Laura preferred it empty. Most of the night shift nurses had already cleared out, heading home to families and normal lives where your hands didn't remember things your mind tried to forget. The folded flag sat in its triangular display case on her locker shelf, positioned exactly as it had been for 3 years and 8 months. One corner of the fabric had worn thin from her touching it too often, running her thumb across the creases the way other people touched wedding rings. Her son's last mission. His last anything. The folded flag was all the army sent home, that and a chaplain with kind eyes who didn't know what to say. Laura had dressed in her dress uniform for the funeral, captain's insignia on her shoulder, and nobody in the civilian cemetery noticed the weight of it because she wore scrubs every day now, unremarkable and invisible, which was exactly the point. She moved through the corridors of the ICU with the deliberate quietness of someone who had learned long ago that noticed people got targeted. Her scrubs were neat, her badge photo unmemorable, a woman in her early 40s with brown hair pulled back, the kind of face you'd forget by the time you passed the next person. But the fluorescent lights caught the scars on her forearms when she adjusted her stethoscope, thin burns that could have been from kitchen accidents or something else entirely, and a man paying attention might have wondered. Dr. Mercer paid attention. He always did. Laura pulled the chart for room 4814, her assigned patient for the next 4 hours. Routine post-op recovery, 63-year-old with pneumonia risk factors. She entered the room, checked the monitors, oxygen saturation steady at 94%, heart rate stable, blood pressure climbing slightly as the sedative wore off, and began her assessment with the methodical precision that had become armor. Count the exits. Scan the windows. Identify the defibrillator location. Locate the crash cart. Memorize the layout the way you would memorize a patrol route. Laura had been running this protocol for 16 years and 9 months, first as a combat nurse in Helmand Province, then in the Green Zone's field hospital, and now in San Antonio's most prestigious teaching hospital where nobody asked questions and everyone assumed you were exactly what you appeared to be. Her leather journal sat in her pocket, separate from all hospital documentation, filled with notations that wouldn't appear in any official record. That was part of the assignment from JSOC, the kind of deep cover work that required years of patience and the ability to disappear into a role so completely that the role became real. 8 months monitoring suspected medical supply diversion. 8 months of watching patterns, noting discrepancies, building a case that would either mean promotions for somebody at the Pentagon or a quiet settlement if things went bad. Laura had learned not to think about which outcome was more likely. The coffee had cooled to exactly the right temperature. She drank it while reviewing medication administration records, her eye scanning for the irregularities she'd been training herself to find. There, a pattern in the ICU's billing codes. Consulting fees that didn't match documented procedures. Numbers that didn't align with the patient population served. The kind of financial sleight of hand that someone who wasn't paying attention would miss entirely. Laura paid attention. That was why they'd sent her here, and that was why Dr. Mercer had already noticed she was paying attention, which meant the next phase of his response would come soon. Social attacks first. That was the pattern with men like Mercer. Humiliation designed to break people down, make them question themselves, push them toward the exit before they got too close to the truth. The ICU opened at 6:15 with the morning shift change. Nurses moved through corridors carrying fresh supplies, calling out handoff reports, the hospital coming to life with the coordinated chaos of a well-run military operation. Laura preferred the structure. It was like returning to a language you'd spoken your whole life. The surgical units, the trauma protocols, the triage hierarchy, it was all organized the way her mind worked, anticipating, planning, identifying threats and resources in a single glance at a room. Dr. Mercer arrived at 6:42 wearing a suit that cost more than Laura's monthly rent. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, $42,000 minimum, the kind of timepiece you wore to communicate that you didn't have to worry about money, that the rules which applied to other people might not apply to you. He moved through the ICU like a man who had internalized the understanding that the space reorganized itself around his presence. 2 residents trailed behind him, taking notes, occasionally offering observations that he dismissed with the casual precision of someone who had spent decades being right more often than not. Laura continued her charting, aware of him the way a seasoned soldier is aware of potential threats, peripheral attention, constant calculation, the part of her brain that never fully relaxed. He paused at the nursing station, his eyes moving across the unit board where assignments had been written that morning in neat block letters. His gaze lingered on Laura's section for 3 seconds longer than necessary. "Good morning, Dr. Mercer," said Jennifer from the day shift, her voice pitched higher than it had been moments before. People did that around him, adjusted themselves, tried to become the versions of themselves they thought he wanted to see. Laura found it exhausting to watch. "Colonel Hartford's transport is expected at 0800. Trauma incoming from Kandahar, transferred through Landstuhl and then Andrews. They're putting him in room 4807. Mercer nodded, making a note on his iPad with a stylus that probably cost more than the entire transport coordination system. "Respiratory distress. Moderate. Shrapnel wounds, left anterior chest. Military medical team says he stabilized en route, but they want full pulmonary workup." Laura's hand stilled over her keyboard. She'd learned, in the field, to recognize the names of commanding officers the way other people remembered song lyrics. Colonel James Hartford. Delta Force. The man whose voice had come through the radio 3 years and 8 months ago with the information that her son's convoy had been hit, that casualties were being evacuated, that there was nothing left to wait for except notification of remains. The man whose final act of service had been to fold her son's unit flag with the precise ceremony of a soldier paying respect to a soldier, and then to mail it to an address he shouldn't have had, a gesture that violated protocol but honored something deeper. Laura continued typing. Room 4807. Direct ICU admission. She had peripheral access to every room on the unit, every chart, every medication administration record. In 4 hours, her assignment would shift to other patients, other patterns, unless someone deliberately reassigned her. She didn't allow her breathing to change. Didn't allow her face to show the calculation happening behind her eyes. The coffee cup sat empty beside her monitor, and she reached for it to have something to do with her hands, a small gesture that looked like nothing. Mercer's expression had shifted infinitesimally. He was looking at the unit board again, at the assignments, at the moment when something had registered as out of place. The tremor in his jaw lasted maybe half a second before he controlled it, but it was there. He'd noticed something in Laura's micro-expression, some flicker of recognition that betrayed the absolute composure she'd maintained for 16 years and 9 months of careful pretense. "I'll be conducting Hartford's initial assessment personally," Mercer said, loud enough for everyone on the unit to hear. "Once he's stabilized, I'll need a full team. The trauma consult will be complicated." He paused, and his eyes moved directly to Laura. "I'll request specific nursing staff based on patient acuity. We can't have anyone on the team who might let personal emotions interfere with clinical judgment. Medical care is about objectivity, after all. Not sentiment." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the regular rhythm of the ICU resumed, monitors beeping, patients breathing through ventilators, the fluorescent lights humming their eternal mechanical drone. Jennifer continued her handoff report, and the residents continued their notations, and nobody except Laura seemed to register that something had just fundamentally changed. She finished her coffee and stood to begin her rounds, moving with the same quiet precision she'd maintained through 16 years of invisibility. In 4 hours, a man was arriving who would recognize her name, her face, the fact that his subordinate officer's mother had materialized in his hospital room wearing scrubs instead of a dress uniform. In 4 hours, everything was going to shift. Colonel James Hartford arrived in room 412 at 10:13 a.m., transported on a stretcher that smelled of diesel fuel and Baghdad dust, his left leg wrapped in compression bandages and his breathing shallow behind an oxygen mask. His wife gripped the bedrail. His teenage daughter stood frozen at the window, not looking at him. Laura Bennett moved through the room with the precision of someone who'd done this work for 18 years, checking the fall line, verifying the monitor leads, documenting his vitals on the chart with the careful notation of someone who knows every number matters. She didn't look at his face. She couldn't afford to. Not yet. The colonel's pulse was elevated, 104 beats per minute, his oxygen saturation hovering at 91% despite the supplemental flow. His chart noted shrapnel wounds from an IED strike near Sadra City, respiratory compromise from smoke inhalation, stable vital signs for transport. She'd read it 3 times in the supply room this morning. She knew exactly who was in room for 12. She knew exactly what he'd done for her son in the Kandahar dust 3 years ago. Dr. Mercer entered at 11:15 a.m. without knocking, his white coat pristine, his expression sharp as a surgical blade. He glanced at the monitor, then at Laura's charting, and his jaw tightened. "Nurse Bennett," he said, his voice loud enough to carry past the colonel's wife to where his daughter stood at the window, loud enough for the family to understand this wasn't a clinical conversation, this was a performance. "Unauthorized chart review again." Laura's hand stilled on the 4-pole. The colonel's wife shifted her weight, uncomfortable. Mercer continued, his tone taking on the cadence of someone explaining something simple to someone simple. "You seem confused about your scope of practice. Or maybe you're just confused in general." He smiled without warmth. "I've explained this before, but I'll use smaller words this time. You document what I tell you to document. Nothing more. Is that simple enough for our remedial nurse?" The room filled with a silence that had weight. Laura met his eyes with a flat, cold stare and waited exactly 3 seconds. When she spoke, her voice came out quiet, not frightened, not angry, just a statement of fact spoken at normal volume. "Your documentation regarding the consulting fees on bed 7. Did you use small words there too, or just small ethics?" Mercer's face went the color of old bone. His jaw tightened until a muscle jumped at the corner of his mouth. Laura turned and walked toward the supply room, leaving him standing there, and she heard him clear his throat twice before beginning to examine the colonel, his hands moving with less precision than before. She didn't see the colonel's eyes track her as she left. She couldn't afford to. By 1:48 p.m., the break room exhaled the smell of microwaved coffee and the faint sourness of yesterday's sandwich trash. Laura sat at the corner table with her packed lunch, turkey on wheat, an apple, a yogurt cup, and began eating mechanically. 30 seconds later, Stephanie from day shift grabbed her lunch container. Marcus from the primary care rotation stood and nodded to Jennifer and Todd. For nurses, moving in synchronized silence, their exodus so coordinated that every person in the room understood this wasn't coincidence. This was orchestration. The coffee cups they'd left steamed on the counter, still warm. Laura didn't stop eating. She didn't look up. She simply continued chewing while the fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric dirge and the wall clock ticked forward. The isolation wasn't surprising. It was stage 3 of an escalation she recognized from intelligence briefings on institutional pressure tactics. Make the target visible. Make her alone. Make her understand that choosing to stand against the hierarchy had consequences. She finished her yogurt and stacked her containers carefully in her lunch bag. Then she walked out of the break room and found her name on the unit board. The red dry erase marker was almost violent in its brightness. Disciplinary action, insubordination. L. Bennett sat in block letters beneath the patient assignment list, visible to every visitor who passed, every family member who walked to the elevators, every staff member who checked the schedule. 2 in turn stared at it while she stood 3 feet away, reading the notation her own eyes couldn't quite believe was there. A woman visiting her mother pointed. A respiratory therapist avoided eye contact as he passed. Mercer was at the nurse's station at 3:19 p.m. when she arrived. He had a folder open. A document. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression suggested he'd been waiting. "Nurse Bennett," he said, his voice carrying that same calculated loudness he'd used in room for 12. Interns gathered like he'd called a teaching conference. Since there seems to be some confusion about professional standards, I want to clarify a few things for everyone here. He read from the document. Repeated violations of chain of command. Unauthorized access to billing records. His eyes flicked up. Disruptive behavior undermining physician authority. Failure to maintain professional boundaries. He turned the page. Insubordination. Another page. Potential patient care risk stemming from erratic judgment. Each phrase landed with the precision of someone trained in institutional power. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The audience was watching. The hierarchy was being reinforced. The message was clear: question me, and this is what happens. Laura stood across from him with her hands at her sides. Her expression was carved from ice. Around them, the world seemed to have stopped moving. No beepers sounding. No phones ringing. Just the fluorescent hum and Mercer's voice reading an indictment that bore almost no relationship to who she actually was or what she'd actually done. When he finished, the silence grew like something alive. Longer than polite. Longer than uncomfortable. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Laura waited until she felt the weight of all that attention, all that judgment, all that institutional certainty, and then she spoke quietly enough that only Mercer could hear, though everyone leaned forward to listen. Your son's medical license. Was it worth what you paid for it, or just what you're billing for it? The color drained from Mercer's face like someone had pulled a plug. The interns exchanged glances. The document trembled slightly in his hands. Laura turned and walked away, and nobody in that nurse's station moved until she disappeared around the corner toward the supply room, where she stood alone for a moment with her back against the cold stainless steel shelving, breathing steadily, her hands perfectly still. She had 15 minutes before evening rounds. 15 minutes before shift change. 15 minutes before everything accelerated. At 6:13 p.m., an emergency admission entered St. Michael's under federal protection. The name on the chart was Khalil Rashid, Iraqi national, political asylum case, acute abdomen, surgical emergency. The charge nurse, operating under orders Laura recognized as Mercer's, reassigned her away from Colonel Hartford's ICU care. Restricted access. Punishment extension. Laura accepted the reassignment without comment and made her way to pre-op staging. Khalil Rashid lay on a surgical bed, his abdomen distended, his breathing rapid and shallow, his eyes half closed from the sedation a federal marshal had authorized 10 minutes earlier. Laura checked his patient bracelet. Verified his identity band. Confirmed the pre-op medications. Standard procedure. Routine work. The kind of thing she'd done thousands of times. Then Khalil's eyes opened fully, and they locked onto her face with the clarity of absolute recognition. His body tried to rise against the bed rails, restrained by soft cuffs, and from his throat emerged a single word in accented English: Ashena. Devil woman. The Arabic name froze the air in the pre-op bay. The federal marshal standing guard looked confused. Laura's hand didn't tremble on Khalil's wrist as she checked his pulse, 124, rapid, elevated adrenaline, but she'd expected that. She'd trained for this. She continued her work with the fall line, her movements precise and unhurried. Khalil began speaking rapid Arabic, his words tumbling together, his sedation pulling at his consciousness but his recognition stronger: the American devil woman. The one who saved 20 fighters in the Sadra City clinic bombing. You pulled my brother from the rubble with the building burning. You are Ashena. The marshal leaned forward, his hand moving near his sidearm, confused about whether this was a threat. Laura met his gaze without looking away from her work, her voice steady and flat. Medication confusion. Sedation does this sometimes. Common reaction. He'll sleep in 30 seconds. Khalil's eyes began to close, his voice fading into whispered Arabic: Ashena. The ghost. The one who, then the sedation one. His eyes closed. His breathing deepened. Laura finished her prep work and pulled off her gloves, snapping them into the sharps container with a sound like small gunshots in the silence. The marshal watched her leave, still confused. But as she stepped into the corridor, she saw Dr. Mercer standing 20 feet away, close enough to have heard at least some of Khalil's words, close enough to have caught the name. His expression was calculating. Predatory. The look of someone who'd just received information he could weaponize. Laura walked past him without breaking stride, her composure intact, her mind already working through the implications. 8 months of intelligence work. 9 months of embedded surveillance. All of it balanced on the edge of a name she couldn't afford to be connected to. All of it about to collapse if Mercer understood what Ashina actually meant. She had to move first. At 0300 hours, the ventilator's rhythm changed. Laura heard it from the pediatric station 3 floors above, not the actual sound, but the absence of it in her mind, the way a combat nurse learns to listen through walls. She'd been photographing her personal phone to the terminal screen, pulling images of Hartford's billing codes, when her eyes caught the ICU status board reflected in the dark window. His oxygen saturation curve had flatlined at 89% and was still dropping. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. The pitch climbing. She didn't move. She couldn't move. Not yet. Not until she was absolutely certain. The numbers fell like dominoes. 87. 84. 81. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the terrible clarity of knowing exactly what was happening in that room 40 yards away through secure access she no longer possessed. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of thing that killed soldiers in the Korengal Valley when there was no needle and no surgeon within 100 clicks. The kind of thing that could be fixed in 90 seconds if someone with steady hands and field hospital training was standing at the bedside. The kind of thing that was about to kill a man she owed a debt to that could never be repaid. She moved. Just stood up from the chair and walked toward the stairwell like a ghost drifting through water. The night shift was skeleton crew, 2 nurses at the pediatric station, both charting, neither looking up. The stairwell door clicked open. Her footsteps echoed against concrete and tile in that particular way that made her think of Baghdad, of running through the Ulnar hospital basement when the mortars started falling, of knowing that every second mattered and every second was slipping away. The ICU corridor materialized around her. The lights buzzed their fluorescent drone. She'd memorized the route even though her badge wouldn't let her through. The nurse's station appeared like a mirage, the charge nurse, Chen, looking up from her computer with that apologetic expression she'd perfected over the past 2 days, the one that said, "I'm sorry, I have to tell you no." "Hartford's crashing," Laura said. Her voice was flat. A statement of medical fact. Tension pneumothorax. You need someone who can decompress. Chen's face went white. Where's the attending? Still in radiology arguing about protocols. You have maybe 2 minutes before his heart stops filling. Where's the attending? Chen moved. That was all it took, a nurse who knew how to read vital signs, recognizing truth delivered in the tone of someone who'd spent her career reading the difference between panic and urgency. The radio crackled. A voice cut through static, code blue, ICU, room for 10. 7 doctors. That was the number that would haunt this story later. 7 of them would have the chance to save Colonel James Hartford in the minutes that followed. 7 of them would fail. The first was Dr. Rendell, the critical care attending, still in the radiology reading room when the code call went out. He would arrive 6 minutes later to find his patient already circling the drain. The second was Dr. Kowalski, the cardiologist, who had been paged but was 3 minutes away at the parking garage, deciding whether he had time to go home before coming back. The third was Dr. Yora Patel, the pulmonologist, who would answer her page while sitting in her car and decide the CT scan needed to come before any intervention. The fourth, fifth, and sixth were residents, newer to critical care, watching their seniors make decisions, waiting for direction that wouldn't come because the room had transformed into something none of them recognized as their jurisdiction. The seventh was the decision itself. The collective paralysis of minds trained to think and trained to fear the lawsuit more than the patient. But Laura didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that the ICU doors had locked her out, and the security badge hanging from her neck was now a useless piece of plastic, and somewhere past those doors, Hartford was dying because Mercer had wanted her gone badly enough to orchestrate the removal of her access. She stood in the corridor, watching the nurses move in practiced chaos. The sounds of a code, shouted parameters, rapid footsteps, the hiss of the ventilator bag being squeezed by a resident whose hands were slightly trembling. She could see none of it. The room's interior was blocked by the angle of the wall. But she could hear it. She could hear the data streaming out in the voices of people doing exactly what they'd been trained to do and failing anyway because training wasn't the same as experience and experience wasn't the same as having learned how to work in a casualty receiving area where you got 1 minute and no second chances. A voice cut through the code noise. Dr. Mercer's voice, crisp and authoritative. "Get the chest X-ray. We need imaging before we do anything." Wrong. He was wrong. Laura's jaw tightened so hard she felt her teeth shift. That wasn't a diagnosis that required confirmation. That was a diagnosis you could hear in the asymmetrical breath sounds, see in the tracheal deviation, feel in the absence of normal chest movement on the right side. In the Korengal, in the casualty collection point outside Bagram, in the Baghdad ER when the Al-Qaeda mortar rounds came through the ceiling, the diagnosis got treated in 90 seconds because 90 seconds was how long you had before a person's heart collapsed and all the imaging in the world became irrelevant. How long for the chest film? That was Rendell, the attending, finally present, finally taking control, but he was already lost, already asking the wrong question, already choosing the protocol over the patient. 5 minutes, someone called out. Maybe 3 if the tech runs. Hartford had 2. Laura moved toward the supply room. Not the main supply room, that would be monitored. The crash cart supply on the pediatric side, the one she'd restocked 2 nights before when Mercer had reassigned her, the one where she'd seen a full inventory of emergency equipment because pediatric patients sometimes went bad in ways that required the same tools as adult codes. She knew where the 14-gauge needle was. She could see it in her mind in the blue case, position 3, right beside the chest tube kit that nobody would think to use because they were all standing in a huddle around the X-ray machine that wasn't producing images fast enough to matter. The supply room door was locked. Her badge opened it. Habit, muscle memory, the terrible small gift that Mercer hadn't yet thought to revoke her access to everything. She pulled the drawer open. The needle was there, exactly where it would be. She'd prepped enough medications in field conditions to do this without thinking, without seeing, without the luxury of hesitation. Her movements were liquid. Automatic. Hands that had held lives together in the dark learned how to work without permission. She was moving back toward the ICU before she'd consciously decided to move, the needle secured in her pocket, the landmarks of Hartford's ribs already calculating in her cerebellum like a targeting computer. The code room was visible now. Chen was compressions on Hartford, his face grey, his chest moving only from her rhythmic pushing, his wife nowhere to be seen because they'd requested she leave, had asked her to wait in the family room while they all stood around and debated. Laura didn't pause. She didn't request permission. She didn't raise her hand. She walked into the code room with the needle in her hand and the absolute certainty of someone who had done this exact thing before, on soldiers whose names she would never write down, in places where stopping to ask permission meant attending the funeral instead of the recovery. Needle decompression, she said. Not a question. A statement of medical fact delivered with the flat certainty of someone stating which direction north was. Second intercostal, midclavicular line. He's been hypoxic for 3 minutes. We're out of time. One of the residents moved. Chen looked up, confused. Rendell turned from the monitor, and for a moment Laura saw his face shift, surprise first, then something else. Something that looked like recognition that this was no longer a situation that would be solved by protocol. "Who are you?" Mercer's voice cut through the noise. Sharp. Dangerous. The voice of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen and how it was going to make him look. "You're not on this code team." Get out. Laura had already counted the ribs. Her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory took over. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, exactly where it needed to be, at exactly the right angle to penetrate the pleural space without hitting the lung tissue below. The hiss of air escaping. Just like that. A sound like satisfaction. Like relief. Like a patient whose body had been suffocating itself suddenly remembering how to breathe. Hartford's oxygen saturation jumped. 87. 91. 95. The monitor registered the change. His heart rate, still elevated but no longer in the death spiral, started climbing toward something that resembled stability. 20 seconds. The entire thing took 20 seconds from the moment the needle went in to the moment the numbers proved the diagnosis was correct and the treatment was complete, and the 7 doctors standing in the room understood that they had been about to let a Delta Force colonel die while they waited for an X-ray. Laura stepped back. She'd already secured the needle, already done what needed to be done. Rendell was moving now, moving fast, ordering the tube setup, ordering the actual chest X-ray that would confirm what they all now knew, giving orders that mattered because Hartford's body had been given back the chance to respond to them. Mercer's face was the color of old paper. She watched it happen. The realization moving across his features like a shadow passing over a wall. The understanding that she had just saved a patient from 7 doctors' collective failure. The terrible awareness that she had done it without permission, without authority, without any of the credentials that mattered in the world he controlled. "Security," he said. His voice was very quiet. Very controlled. But she could hear the fracture in it, the place where his certainty had cracked. "I want her removed from the building. Now." The security officers were there within minutes. By then Hartford's vitals had stabilized completely. By then the chest film had confirmed the needle had done exactly what it needed to do. By then 7 doctors were standing in a room that suddenly felt very small and very full of a truth that none of them could UNC. Laura didn't resist when the officers took her arm. She had expected this. She had known, the moment she pushed open that code room door, that Mercer would burn his remaining credibility trying to have her removed rather than admit what had just happened. She had known that saving the patient was going to accelerate everything, the timeline, the exposure, the moment when her hidden identity would move from theoretical liability to practical certainty. The hallway stretched before her. Long and fluorescent and smelling of antiseptic and the particular kind of hospital silence that comes after a code, that strange quiet when adrenaline releases and people realize they're still alive. Mercer was already on his phone, already making calls, already trying to shore up whatever remained of his authority before the story of what had happened in room 410 reached the hospital board, the nursing oversight committee, the places where his reputation still mattered. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she understood now exactly what he was capable of. She understood that his strategic competence, the kind that had allowed him to orchestrate her isolation, her reassignment, her removal from the care team, was about to shift into something more dangerous. He would lean harder now. Push faster. Make phone calls that went higher than the hospital board. Because Captain Laura Bennett had just proven she was the kind of person who would break the rules to save a patient. And Dr. Mercer had just proven he was the kind of person who would burn down his entire career rather than admit he needed her. She'd moved first, just like she'd planned. But now the game had truly begun. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause for the dead. Commerce Street was empty at 4 in the morning, the kind of empty that swallows sound. Laura Bennett stood at the bus stop with a cardboard box balanced on her hip, the soggy cardboard already starting to bow under its own weight. Her scrubs were soaked through. Her hair hung in wet ropes against her neck. The box contained the things that mattered. On top, a cracked nursing school mug with a faded caduceus symbol, the kind of thing you kept for nostalgia, not function. Beside it, a wilting succulent in a clay pot, its leaves paper-thin and browning at the edges. She'd watered it 3 times a week for 7 months and it had died anyway. That seemed appropriate. Below those items, wrapped in tissue paper folded with military precision, was the flag. Triangular. Crisp despite its age. The fabric had that waxy feel of something that had been handled too carefully, too many times. This flag had draped her son's casket in Arlington National Cemetery on a Tuesday in March. It had been folded by hands that knew the ritual, 1 fold, 2 folds, 3 folds, until it became a dense triangle that fit in your palm like a stone. The folded flag was the only thing the army had returned to her that still felt alive. Beneath the flag sat the photograph. Her son's face, 23 years old, smiling against a desert background so bright it looked false. His name was Marcus. He had been a ranger, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. He had been killed by an IED in Marja, Helmand Province, by someone he never saw coming. The Delta Force Colonel, James Hartford, had been his commanding officer. Hartford had sent the flag personally, with a letter that Laura had read so many times the creases had worn through the paper. A bus rolled past the stop without slowing. The driver didn't even look at her. Laura shifted the box's weight. The cardboard flexed in a way that made her wince. Everything in this city would break if you waited long enough. She'd learned that in Baghdad. She'd learned that broken things could still function if you held them together tight enough, long enough, until someone else could take over. The rain fell harder. 6 hours later, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Laura sat in the St. Michael's Hospital conference room in civilian clothes still damp from the dawn rain. She'd been called back for a board meeting. She'd assumed it was her termination hearing. The room contained Dr. Mercer, the hospital CEO, 2 board members, and 3 people she didn't recognize. 1 wore a Marine Corps dress uniform. 1 carried a Pentagon credentials badge. 1 was a 2-star Army general in full dress uniform, the kind of uniform that made the air pressure in a room change. Laura had not expected this. Dr. Mercer began speaking before she'd even sat down. His voice had that edge to it, the edge of a man who knew he'd already lost but was determined to die screaming. This woman violated her suspension order, performed procedures without authorization, and directly endangered. The Marine liaison stood. He was a major, reading glasses on a chain, a folder thick with documents. His voice cut through Mercer's like a knife through tissue. Captain Laura Bennett, United States Army Nurse Corps. Mercer's face went slack. The general remained motionless. The CEO's pen stopped moving. The major continued, his voice steady as a metronome. Service number 4472983. Current assignment, Joint Special Operations Command, Embedded Intelligence Operations. He turned a page. The sound of paper moving was the only noise in the room besides rain on the windows. Combat deployments, Iraq, 2007 to 2008. Afghanistan, 2010 to 2011. Iraq again, 2014 to 2015. Medical operations in Fallujah, Jolan District. Field hospital assignments outside Kandahar. Confirmed stabilization of 17 critical casualties under direct mortar attack in Baghdad Sadr City District. Laura's hands rested flat on the table. She didn't move. She didn't blink. The general stood. He faced her directly and saluted with the kind of crisp precision that belonged on a recruiting poster. The salute held for 3 seconds. Then he lowered his hand and simply nodded. It was the kind of nod that meant everything. Someone had retrieved her Class A uniform from her apartment, JSOC had a key, had always had a key, and hung it on a chair visible to everyone. The silver star was visible among the ribbons. The Purple Heart was there too. 2 medals for wounds that had healed invisible. 2 medals for the kind of pain that didn't show in X-rays. Dr. Mercer tried to speak. His voice came out strangled. This is absurd. I want her arrested for assault, for. A man in a dark suit, the one with the Pentagon badge, set down a tablet. His voice was flat. Bureaucratic. The voice of someone reading from a checklist. Captain Bennett's cover assignment, codename Nightingale Audit, involved monitoring suspected medical supply diversion and fraudulent billing at this facility over a 9-month period. He turned the tablet screen toward Mercer. On it was a spreadsheet. Rows and rows of numbers. Consulting fees that didn't match procedures. ICU charges for equipment never ordered. Medicare submissions for treatments that existed only on paper. 9 months of documentation. $2.3 million in inflated charges. Phantom procedures. Kickback arrangements. The Pentagon investigator leaned forward slightly. The nursing board complaint you filed against Captain Bennett triggered an expedited federal audit. Your own weapon, Doctor. Your own complaint. It opened every door we needed. Mercer's face had moved beyond pale. He looked like a man watching his own execution in real time. The colonel's wife appeared in the doorway. She'd been waiting outside. Someone had prepared her for this moment, had let her know that the nurse who'd saved her husband's life last night at 3 a.m. was not a suspended staff member with a disciplinary notice. She was a captain. She was a warrior. She was someone's daughter who had carried a folded flag through rain because carrying it home meant she'd finally stopped running. The wife crossed the room and embraced Laura. She was crying. You saved him, she whispered. You saved James, and before that, you sent word about our son. You helped us find Marcus. You brought him home. Laura's composure held. It had held through Baghdad. It had held through every humiliation Mercer had orchestrated. It held now. But somewhere in her chest, something shifted. A single tear moved down her cheek. Just one. Just enough to acknowledge that some things, once you've carried them long enough, become too heavy to hold alone. The general spoke again, his voice low and formal. Colonel Hartford regained consciousness at 8:41 this morning. His first words were about the nurse from the field hospital in Baghdad. He remembered you. He insisted we resolve this situation immediately. The general paused. He also wanted you to know that your son died protecting people who are still alive because of him. That matters. It has to matter. Mercer was escorted from the room by federal agents who moved with a kind of efficiency that came from doing this exact thing 1,000 times before. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just walked out like a man who'd already been erased. The silence in the room lasted 8 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was the kind of silence that comes after something fundamental shifts, when the world has been rearranged and everyone is still getting their bearings. Laura picked up the tablet showing the spreadsheet. Her eyes moved across the numbers. 2.3 million. The fraud was precise. Documented. Clean. Everything Mercer had done in the shadows, she had been watching from the shadows too. She'd been JSOC's eyes inside the hospital while pretending to be nobody. Just a nurse. Just someone who'd spent 6 months absorbing humiliation so that nobody would notice she was collecting evidence. The Marine Major closed his folder. Your orders are being reassigned, Captain. There's a Delta Force medical liaison position at SOCOM headquarters in Tampa. Full restoration of rank, immediate retroactive pay adjustment, and a formal apology from this hospital that will be in writing within 24 hours. Laura set the tablet down. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It was no longer deferential. It was no longer soft. It carried the weight of command. I'll need to speak with Colonel Hartford first. Before I accept anything. The general smiled. For the first time, he looked like a human being instead of a uniform. He's in recovery. Room for 12. He's been asking for you since he woke up. The surgical suite fell silent. Not the quiet of focus. The quiet of recognition. The patient on the pre-op table, admitted as Ahmed Hassan, a former insurgent leader now seeking asylum, locked eyes with Laura as she approached with the consent forms. His hand moved. His lips formed a single word in Arabic, Ashana. The devil woman. It was what they called her in Baghdad's bloodiest district. What the fighters whispered when she appeared at forward operating bases, soaked in someone else's blood, moving between wounded men with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of something that couldn't die. Laura's face remained neutral. Her hand steady as she took his vitals. But the room's atmosphere had shifted like pressure before a storm. A Marine Corps liaison stood near the observation window, dress uniform pressed sharp enough to cut skin, holding a leather folder. He had arrived an hour earlier with federal credentials and instructions to wait until the moment the identity became public. Until the room full of surgical staff and anesthesiologists and hospital administrators understood exactly who they were standing next to. He opened the folder. His voice cut through the silence, formal, ceremonial, the weight of the Pentagon behind every word. Captain Laura Bennett, he began, reading from the citation, Silver Star recipient for actions under enemy fire. 3 combat deployments. Assigned to 75th Ranger Regiment Support Operations, Baghdad Forward Operating Base Falcon, 2013 through 2015. Dr. Mercer heard his name spoken in the hallway 3 seconds before he shoved through the surgical suite doors. His face was purple. Veins stood out in his neck like cables. Security, he was shouting. I want her arrested. Now. She's been falsifying credentials, operating under a fraudulent nursing license, conducting unauthorized. His voice stopped. There, standing beside the anesthesia station in her medical scrubs, was Laura in her street clothes being held up by a 2-star general who had just walked through the observation window door. Not walked. Entered. The way generals enter rooms, as if the air itself shifts to accommodate them. The Marine liaison continued reading. His voice never wavered, even as Mercer sputtered and died. Battlefield triage of 17 critical casualties during the siege of Sanjin Valley. Performed emergency surgical intervention under sustained small arms fire. Continued treatment despite 2 shrapnel wounds to her abdomen and left shoulder. Refused evacuation until all 17 patients had been stabilized for transport. The general's hand rose to his brow. A salute. Clean. Deliberate. In front of a surgical suite full of doctors and nurses who suddenly understood they had been working beside someone they had profoundly, catastrophically misjudged. Laura's uniform appeared as if summoned. Someone had retrieved it from her locker. The dress blues hung on a stand beside her, captain's rank insignia visible on the shoulders. Service ribbons catching the surgical lights. The Silver Star ribbon positioned exactly where it belonged. A Pentagon investigator emerged from the observation window. His badge was leather. His voice was ice. He moved toward Mercer with the unhurried pace of a man watching a building collapse in real time. Dr. Robert Mercer, the investigator said, Captain Bennett's cover assignment to St. Michael's Hospital was authorized by JSOC to monitor suspected medical supply diversion involving your ICU billing department. Her covert documentation, chart photography, timestamp records, cross-referenced consultant billing codes, establishes direct responsibility for $2.3 million in fraudulent Medicare billing over 48 months. Funds transferred to Caribbean offshore accounts registered in your name and your son's trust. You're aware that filing a false professional conduct complaint against Captain Bennett triggered an automatic hospital audit, which exposed everything. Mercer's mouth opened. No sound came out. Your medical license is revoked, the investigator continued. Permanent. Effective immediately. Criminal prosecution begins Monday. Your attorney will receive formal notice by end of business today. The surgical suite was silent the way hospital rooms go silent when someone dies. That particular texture of air. The fluorescent light seemed to hum louder. Laura stepped into her dress uniform with the ease of someone returning to a familiar skin. The boots were polished mirror black. The ribbons were exactly straight. When she buttoned the jacket, 7 surgical staff members involuntarily stepped back. The general extended his hand. Laura shook it. His grip was firm. His eyes held the specific respect reserved for people who had spent time in places where the wrong decision meant death. Welcome home, Captain, he said. Just that. Just those 4 words. Mercer was being escorted out by hospital security. He was still speaking, protests, threats, denials, but his voice sounded hollow, like someone shouting into a well that had already swallowed the echo. 6 months later, Laura drove through San Antonio's northwest district under a sky the color of brushed aluminum. The community college sat back from the road, red brick buildings arranged in a campus quad that smelled like fresh-cut grass and possibility. She parked and walked to the Allied Health Building. Room 107. A narrow window beside the door offered a clear view inside. Dr. Robert Mercer stood in front of a class of 20 students in a polo shirt and khakis. No white coat. No stethoscope. No presence. Just a man in standard-issue community college instructor clothing, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic CPR dummy. His voice carried no authority. He was explaining hand placement, explaining rhythm, explaining the difference between effective compressions and the kind that break ribs. A student raised her hand with a question. Mercer answered it with the tone of someone reading from a manual. No condescension. No arrogance. Just factual information delivered by a man who taught basic life support for $18 an hour. The course catalog had him listed as Instructor, Fundamentals of CPR on a 1-year renewable contract. The expensive watch that once caught light in hospital corridors was gone. His wedding ring was gone. His right hand bore the pale stripe where it had lived. His movements were mechanical, practiced on that plastic dummy night after night, teaching people how to save lives while his own life compressed down to the size of a community college classroom. Laura stood at the window for 90 seconds. Her hand moved to her jacket pocket where the folded flag rested, the one that had arrived after her son Daniel was killed in Baghdad under Colonel Hartford's command. The flag her son had carried into the last mission of his life. She held it there, feeling the weight of folded fabric and the history pressed into every crease. She whispered his name, Daniel. The word hung in the San Antonio air like a prayer. Then she turned and walked back to her car without looking back at the window, without watching Mercer adjust the dummy's position, without waiting for recognition or acknowledgement that would never come anyway. St. Michael's ICU looked different in the late afternoon light, less like a place of crisis and more like a place of recovery. Laura stood in the conference room in her full army dress uniform, captain's rank visible on both shoulders, the Silver Star ribbon positioned above her heart. 70 staff members had gathered. The 4 nurses who had walked out of the break room when she sat down, they stood together in the back corner, their faces carrying the weight of a moment they couldn't undo. Colonel Hartford stood beside the hospital CEO. His wife held their daughter's hand. He had regained 40 pounds since that night at 0300 hours when his oxygen crashed and 7 doctors stood frozen while one quiet nurse moved toward the impossible. The scars on his neck and chest had faded to white. He looked alive in a way that transcended biology. The CEO stepped forward. We've established the Captain Daniel Bennett Memorial Fund for Combat Veteran Healthcare. Captain, this hospital and everyone in it owes you a debt that no plaque can measure. Colonel Hartford took the microphone. His voice filled the room like the sound of boots on tarmac. Captain Bennett saved my life twice. First in Baghdad, when she ensured my unit recovered her son's remains in 2015, even though it meant revealing our position to enemy forces. She could have stayed hidden. She could have protected herself. She stood up instead. He paused. His daughter handed Laura a photograph, Daniel and the colonel together in the Baghdad heat, both smiling despite everything. Second, Hartford continued, she refused to let 7 doctors' paralysis become my death sentence. When everyone stepped back, she moved forward. That's not just nursing. That's not just courage. That's the definition of who we need to be. Laura stepped to the microphone. Her voice was steady. Measured. The voice of someone accustomed to speaking in operating theaters and forward command posts. I didn't defy 7 doctors because I'm brave. I did it because the patient needed someone to act, and no one else would. My son taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the refusal to let fear choose for you. Every person in this room has that choice. Every shift. Every patient. She paused. The silence grew comfortable. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. The applause built like waves. Afterward, in the break room, the 4 nurses approached her individually. Apologies came in 4 different tones of voice but carried the same weight. Laura accepted each one with the same flat composure she had shown Mercer 6 months earlier, not warm, not cold, just factual. She understood that people made mistakes. She also understood that understanding didn't require forgiveness. She packed her belongings from her reassigned locker, the nursing school mug, repaired now with gold kintsugi epoxy that made the cracks beautiful. The succulent, thriving after months of careful watering. The folded flag from Daniel's coffin. She held all of it against her chest and walked toward the exit. The unit board by the elevator had changed. The red marker announcing disciplinary action, insubordination was gone. In its place, Captain L. Bennett, Silver Star, thank you for your service. She didn't stop to read it. Outside, Colonel Hartford waited by her car in the San Antonio sunset. The light was turning gold, making the hospital tower glow like something sacred. Your next assignment? He asked. Classified, Laura replied. But somewhere a hospital needs a very quiet nurse. She drove away as the sun descended behind the building. In her rearview mirror, St. Michael's shrank to the size of memory. If you've made it this far, you understand something that most people never do: heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a nurse who says nothing while the world tears her down. Sometimes it's choosing to act when everyone around you chooses paralysis. Subscribe for more stories about the people no one sees coming. Like this video. Comment with your own story of being underestimated. Because every single one of you is more than the world assumes.